Just as vows are about to be exchanged, a horse interrupts a wedding ceremony. The bride's response to this unexpected appearance is unforgettable. And if you cherish your family and love stories like this, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and avoid 10 years of bad luck. Sarah stood at the entrance of the outdoor venue, her white dress catching the late afternoon sunlight. The setup was exactly as she had planned over the past year. White chairs arranged in neat rows on the manicured lawn, wildflowers decorating the aisle, and an elegant arch covered in roses marking where she and David would exchange their vows. 200 guests filled the seats, their heads turning as the first notes of the wedding march began to play. Her father squeezed her arm gently as they prepared to walk down the aisle. "Ready, sweetheart?" he whispered. Sarah nodded, though something in her stomach fluttered, not the typical wedding day butterflies, but something deeper, more unsettling. She pushed the feeling aside, attributing it to normal pre-wedding jitters. David waited at the altar, dressed in a tailored black suit. His smile, usually so reassuring, seemed different today, perhaps more nervous than she'd ever seen it. The guests rose as Sarah began her walk, their phones raised to capture the moment. Her bridesmaids, led by her best friend Mia, beamed at her from their position near the arch. The weather was perfect for an outdoor ceremony. 72 degrees, clear skies, with just enough breeze to carry the scent of roses across the venue. Sarah had chosen this location specifically because it reminded her of the countryside where she grew up, though she hadn't visited that place in years. Each step brought her closer to David, and with each step, that strange feeling in her stomach intensified. The celebrant, a family friend named James, stood ready with his book. Sarah could see the wedding rings gleaming on the small table beside him. Everything was proceeding exactly according to plan, yet something felt off-kilter, like a painting hanging slightly crooked on a wall. As Sarah reached the altar, David took her hands in his. His palms were sweaty, and she could feel a slight tremor in his grip. The guests settled back into their seats, and James began his welcome speech about love, commitment, and the journey two people take together. Sarah tried to focus on his words, but her attention kept drifting to the tree line beyond the ceremony space. The celebrant's voice seemed to fade in and out as Sarah's mind wandered. She caught fragments of his speech. Gathered here today, sacred bond, lifetime of love, but something else demanded her attention. A movement in the distance, perhaps? A shadow among the trees? David squeezed her hands, bringing her focus back to the ceremony. She could see concern in his eyes, matching the worried glance Mia shot her from the side. Sarah tried to center herself, to be present in this moment she'd planned for so long. The celebrant had reached the part about their personal vows, and David was about to begin his. That's when she heard it, a sound she hadn't heard in 15 years, but one she would recognize anywhere. The steady rhythm of hooves approaching, growing louder with each beat. The guests began to murmur, turning in their seats to locate the source of the interruption. Sarah's heart stopped as a magnificent bay horse emerged from the tree line, his coat gleaming in the afternoon sun. She knew that star-shaped marking on his forehead, knew the proud arch of his neck, the intelligent gleam in his dark eyes. Charlie, her Charlie, who had disappeared during a storm when she was 14, leaving her heartbroken and forever changed. The horse moved purposefully through the rows of chairs, ignoring the gasps and exclamations from the guests. His eyes were fixed on Sarah, and in that moment, everything else faded away. The ceremony, the guests, even David's hands holding hers. Charlie stopped at the edge of the aisle, mere feet from where she stood in her wedding dress, and gently nickered in greeting. The celebrant had stopped speaking. David had dropped her hands. 200 guests held their breath, waiting to see what would happen next. Sarah stood frozen, torn between the life she had planned and the piece of her past that had suddenly, inexplicably, returned to her. Sarah took an unconscious step toward Charlie, her wedding dress rustling against the grass. The familiar scent of horse, hay, leather, and something uniquely Charlie filled her nostrils, triggering a flood of memories. Her hand reached out, trembling slightly, and Charlie lowered his head to meet her touch. The connection was immediate and profound. His coat felt exactly as she remembered, smooth and warm under her fingertips. Charlie's whiskers twitched as he investigated her dress, leaving slight marks on the white fabric, but Sarah couldn't bring herself to care. 15 years melted away in an instant. Behind her, David cleared his throat uncomfortably. The guests remained silent, creating an almost theatrical atmosphere as they watched the scene unfold. Sarah could hear Mia's heels clicking on the wooden platform as she shifted her weight, uncertain whether to intervene. "It's really you," Sarah whispered, running her hand along Charlie's neck. The horse had aged, of course. There was more gray around his eyes, and his once pure bay coat showed signs of silver. But he was undeniably the same horse who had been her closest companion throughout childhood. He even wore the same distinctive scar above his right hoof, a reminder of the day he'd jumped a fence to follow her home from school. David finally spoke, his voice strained with forced calm. "Sarah, should we continue?" The question hung in the air, heavy with implications. The celebrant shuffled his papers nervously, clearly unprepared for this deviation from the traditional ceremony script. An elderly guest in the front row, Sarah's grandmother Martha, suddenly stood up. "That's the horse, isn't it?" she called out, her voice carrying across the venue. "The one you used to write stories about?" Several other guests began to murmur, recognition dawning as they remembered the tales of Sarah's childhood companion. Charlie remained perfectly still, his presence both grounding and unsettling. He seemed unperturbed by the crowd, focused entirely on Sarah. When she scratched his favorite spot behind his ears, he leaned into her touch, just as he had done countless times before. The bridesmaids exchanged uncertain glances. Mia took a tentative step forward, her burgundy dress catching the light. "Maybe we should take a brief break," she suggested, looking between Sarah and David. Her words seemed to break a spell, and suddenly the guests began talking among themselves. David stood awkwardly at the altar, his carefully prepared vows still unspoken. He watched as Sarah continued to stroke Charlie's neck, her engagement ring catching the sunlight with each movement. The connection between them was undeniable and somehow threatening in its intensity. An older man in the third row stood up, drawing attention. "I remember when I lost my dog," he announced, his voice thick with emotion. "Found him 2 years later. Sometimes these things happen for a reason." This prompted others to share similar stories. Tales of lost pets returning, of meaningful coincidences, of fate's mysterious workings. The wedding ceremony had transformed into something entirely different. Instead of witnessing the expected exchange of vows, the guests found themselves part of a moment that felt almost magical in its improbability. Charlie's appearance had sparked a collective sharing of stories about love, loss, and unexpected reunions. Sarah finally turned back toward the altar, her hand still resting on Charlie's neck. Her eyes met David's, and in that moment, both knew that the carefully planned ceremony couldn't continue, at least not as intended. The question wasn't just about a wedding anymore. It was about understanding what it means to love, to lose, and to find something you thought was gone forever. Sarah gently took Charlie's reins, which seemed to have appeared from nowhere, just like him, and led him away from the ceremony space. Her wedding heels sank slightly into the grass as she walked, each step taking her further from the carefully orchestrated event and closer to something she couldn't yet define. She found herself heading toward a small grove of oak trees at the edge of the property. The murmur of confused guests faded behind her, replaced by the sound of Charlie's steady breathing and the soft thud of his hooves. Her mind raced with questions. Where had he been all these years? How did he find her? Why today of all days? Memories surfaced unbidden. Long summer afternoons spent riding bareback through meadows, Charlie responding to her slightest touch. The way he'd wait by her window every morning, nickering softly until she came out to greet him. The stormy night when he disappeared, leaving her to spend months searching, calling his name until her voice gave out. From her secluded spot, Sarah could see the wedding setup. The white chairs now in slight disarray as guests mingled uncertainly. David engaged in what appeared to be an intense conversation with his best man, Mia hovering nearby with concern etched on her face. The scene looked like a photograph from someone else's life. Charlie nudged her shoulder, drawing her attention back to him. His eyes held the same intelligent gleam she remembered, the one that had made her believe he understood every word she said. She'd spent countless hours confiding in him during her teenage years, sharing dreams, fears, and secrets she couldn't tell anyone else. "I planned everything so carefully," she said aloud, more to herself than to Charlie. The wedding had been a year in the making. Every detail meticulously chosen, from the hand-calligraphed place cards to the exact shade of burgundy for the bridesmaids' dresses. Yet in a matter of minutes, all that planning had been rendered meaningless by the simple appearance of a horse she'd lost 15 years ago. Sarah reached down and slipped off her wedding shoes, letting her feet sink into the cool grass. The gesture felt symbolic somehow, like stepping out of one life and into another, or perhaps back into an old one she'd forgotten she wanted. Her mind wandered to David. He was everything she thought she wanted: successful, kind, stable. They'd built a comfortable life together in the city, far from the rural landscape of her childhood. She hadn't ridden a horse in years, hadn't even visited a stable. Somewhere along the way, she'd packed away that part of herself like old photographs stored in a box. Charlie's unexpected appearance forced her to confront questions she'd been avoiding. Why had she stopped riding? Why had she chosen an apartment in the city instead of the countryside she loved? When had she started prioritizing others' expectations over her own desires? The sound of approaching footsteps pulled her from her thoughts. She turned to see Mia making her way across the grass, managing to look elegant despite navigating the uneven ground in her heels. Sarah noticed she carried a water bottle and couldn't help but smile. Mia always knew exactly what was needed. Charlie, surprisingly, didn't shy away from the newcomer. Instead, he turned his head to observe Mia's approach with what Sarah could have sworn was approval. The horse, who had been her closest confidant, seemed ready to share space with her current best friend, bridging past and present in an unexpected way. Sarah realized she'd been holding her breath and let it out slowly. The simple act of breathing reminded her of the meditation techniques she'd learned during wedding planning, meant to keep her calm and focused. Instead, they now helped her recognize that this moment of interruption might actually be an intervention, one she didn't know she needed. Mia approached carefully, holding out the water bottle like a peace offering. She'd removed her heels, carrying them in her free hand, a gesture of solidarity that wasn't lost on Sarah. Without speaking, she handed Sarah the water and settled onto a fallen log nearby, smoothing her burgundy dress beneath her. "So," Mia said finally, breaking the silence, "that's Charlie." It wasn't a question. She'd heard enough stories over their decade of friendship to recognize the significance of the horse's appearance. Sarah had mentioned Charlie during late-night conversations, usually after a few glasses of wine, when old memories felt safe to revisit. "I can't explain it," Sarah said, taking a sip of water. "He just appeared, like he knew exactly where to find me, like he knew I needed." She trailed off, unsure how to complete the thought. Charlie stood nearby, grazing contentedly, as if this were the most natural thing in the world. Mia watched her friend carefully. As Sarah's maid of honor, she'd been there through every step of the wedding planning. The dress fittings, the menu tastings, the endless discussions about flower arrangements. She'd also been there 3 years ago when Sarah first met David, watching their relationship develop into what everyone called a perfect match. "You know," Mia began carefully, "I never told you this, but I found your old riding boots in your closet when we were organizing for the engagement party. They were hidden behind all those designer shoes you never wear." She paused, letting the observation sink in. "You kept them all these years." Sarah's hand instinctively went to Charlie's neck, finding comfort in the familiar texture of his coat. "I couldn't bring myself to throw them away, just like I couldn't delete the photos from the competitions or give away my old ribbons." She looked at Mia. "Does that make me someone who can't let go of the past? Or maybe," Mia suggested gently, "it makes you someone who hasn't finished writing that chapter of your story." She gestured toward the wedding setup in the distance. "Sarah, I've known you for 10 years. I've watched you build the life everyone expected. The corporate job, the city apartment, the sensible relationship. But I've never seen you look as alive as you do right now, standing here with Charlie." The truth of Mia's words hit Sarah with unexpected force. She remembered the day she'd accepted the job in the city, how she convinced herself that leaving the countryside was part of growing up, how she'd slowly replaced riding boots with high heels, meadows with meeting rooms, the rhythm of hoofbeats with the rhythm of subway cars. David's a good man, Mia continued, voicing what Sarah couldn't. But maybe the question isn't whether you love him. Maybe it's whether the life you've planned together has room for all of who you are, including the part of you that belongs in riding boots instead of wedding heels. Charlie lifted his head from grazing and moved closer, positioning himself between the two women. Mia reached out hesitantly, and the horse allowed her to stroke his nose. You know, Mia said, in all those stories you told me about Charlie, there was one thing that always stood out. You said he never let you pretend to be something you weren't, that he somehow always knew when you were being true to yourself and when you weren't. Sarah felt tears forming in her eyes. He would refuse to move if I was riding angry or scared. He'd just stand there until I got honest about what I was feeling. She wiped her eyes with the back of her hand, leaving a smudge of mascara. I'd forgotten about that. While Sarah and Mia talked beneath the oak trees, David found himself sitting on the altar steps, his best man Jack beside him. The guests had dispersed into small clusters, their conversation a low hum across the venue. He loosened his bow tie, feeling the weight of 200 pairs of eyes occasionally glancing his way. I always knew she grew up around horses, he said to Jack, breaking their uncomfortable silence. But the way she looked at that horse... He trailed off, remembering the moment Charlie appeared. He'd never seen that expression on Sarah's face before, a mixture of joy, recognition, and something else he couldn't quite name. Something that made him feel like a stranger at his own wedding. Jack shifted uncomfortably in his suit. Maybe it's just shock, he offered. I mean, who wouldn't be thrown off by something like this? It's not every day your childhood pet crashes your wedding. But even as he said it, both men knew this was more than simple surprise or nostalgia. David thought back to the early days of their relationship. Sarah had mentioned Charlie once or twice, but always in passing, like someone discussing a distant relative they'd lost touch with. He'd never understood the depth of that connection, had never asked about the riding ribbons he'd glimpsed in her storage boxes when they moved in together. You know what gets me? David said, watching Sarah and Mia in the distance. In 3 years together, I've never seen her look that free. The word tasted bitter in his mouth. He prided himself on being a good partner, supportive, stable, reliable. He thought that was what Sarah wanted, what she needed. An older man approached them. Professor Morrison, Sarah's former mentor from university. He sat down uninvited, his weathered face thoughtful. When Sarah was in my creative writing class, he said, every story she wrote had horses in it. Every single one. I used to tease her about it, tell her to broaden her horizons. He shook his head, but now I wonder if she was trying to tell us something all along. David remembered the apartment hunting process, how he'd pushed for the city center location while Sarah had lingered over listings in the suburbs, places with easy access to riding stables. He convinced her that being close to their offices made more sense. She'd agreed, but now he recalled how long she'd stared at those suburban houses before closing the laptop. What am I supposed to do? David asked, not really expecting an answer. Stand here and watch while my fiancé chooses a horse over our future together? The words sounded petulant even to his own ears, but he couldn't help feeling like a supporting character in someone else's story. Jack cleared his throat. Maybe that's not what's happening here, he suggested carefully. Maybe this isn't about choosing between you and the horse. Maybe it's about Sarah choosing herself. Observation it David like a physical blow. He thought about their life together, the careful plans, the shared calendar, the comfortable routine. Had he ever really asked Sarah what she wanted? Not what made logical sense, not what fit their 5-year plan, but what made her eyes light up the way they had when Charlie appeared. Professor Morrison stood up, brushing off his suit pants. You know, he said, in literature, we often talk about the moment of recognition, the point where a character suddenly understands something that changes everything. The Greeks called it anagnorisis. Sometimes it's not about what we gain or lose, but about what we finally see clearly. David watched as Charlie nuzzled Sarah's shoulder, leaving a slight mark on her wedding dress. The sight would have annoyed him an hour ago. Now it seemed like a message he was finally ready to read. The wedding venue had transformed into something entirely unexpected. As the afternoon sun cast long shadows across the lawn, guests began rearranging chairs into informal circles, creating intimate spaces for conversation. The rigid ceremony layout dissolved into organic gathering spots, much like the dissolution of the ceremony's formality itself. Mrs. Chun, Sarah's elderly neighbor, was the first to really break the ice. Standing up with surprising energy for her 80 years, she commanded attention. "When I was young in China," she began, her voice carrying across the lawn, "my grandfather had a horse that saved our entire family during the revolution. We thought we'd lost him in the chaos, but 3 years later, he found us in our new city." She paused, looking directly at David. Sometimes animals understand things about destiny that we humans take years to learn. Her story opened the floodgates. Thomas, a gruff local veterinarian who'd been invited through David's side, stood next. "Been practicing for 30 years, he said, clearing his throat. "Seen hundreds of cases of animals finding their way home. Had a cat once that traveled 400 miles to find its family. There's something we don't understand about their connection to us." The wedding photographer, who'd been awkwardly documenting the unexpected turn of events, lowered her camera to share her own tale. "I actually changed careers because of my dog," she admitted. "Was working in finance, miserable every day. My dog would sit and stare at me every morning, refusing to let me leave for work. Eventually, I realized he knew something I didn't, that I needed to change my life." Even David's mother, Patricia, typically reserved and proper, found herself contributing. "I was against David getting a dog when he was 10, she revealed, surprising her son. "But that golden retriever taught him more about responsibility and love than I ever could. Sometimes the things we don't plan for end up being exactly what we need." Each story seemed to weave a larger narrative. A teenage cousin spoke about her rescue horse helping her through depression. Sarah's uncle recalled how his parrot had detected his wife's illness before any doctor. One of David's colleagues shared how losing his pet had led him to meet his wife at a grief support group. The stories varied in detail, but shared a common thread. Moments when animals had somehow known better than humans, had guided them, had appeared or disappeared at precisely the right moment to catalyze necessary change. The wedding planner, who'd been frantically checking her phone for guidance on handling such an unprecedented situation, finally gave up and shared her own story about a stray cat that had prevented her from boarding a flight that later encountered serious problems. As the stories flowed, the atmosphere shifted. What had started as an interrupted wedding ceremony evolved into something more authentic, a gathering of people sharing truths about love, intuition, and the mysterious ways life sometimes forces us to pay attention. Sandra, David's tough-as-nails aunt who normally scoffed at anything sentimental, surprised everyone with her vulnerability. "My husband," she said, her voice unusually soft, "promised me a horse farm when we were young. We chose practical things instead: bigger house, better cars, private schools for the kids. 30 years later, I still dream about those horses we never had." The catering staff, who'd been unsure whether to begin serving the reception food, found themselves drawn into the gathering. One waiter shared how his pet rabbit had helped him through his divorce. The head chef spoke about the goat that had inspired him to become a chef on a farm-to-table restaurant. Sarah stood up from the fallen log, still holding Charlie's reins. The sound of shared stories drifted toward her on the breeze, each tale adding weight to the decision she knew she had to make. With Mia at her side, she walked Charlie back toward the wedding setup, her bare feet steady on the cooling grass. "I can't go through with it," she said quietly, more to herself than to Mia. "Not today. Not like this." The words felt both terrible and liberating, like lancing an infected wound. The relief of speaking them aloud, mixed with the guilt of what they would mean for everyone involved. David saw them approaching and stood up from the altar. P.S.'s bow tie hung loose around his neck, and his perfectly styled hair showed signs of anxious fingers running through it. Their eyes met across the space, and in that moment, both recognized the inevitability of what would come next. "Everyone," Sarah called out, her voice stronger than she expected. The conversations gradually quieted as guests turned to face her. She stood there, a striking figure in her wedding dress, one hand on Charlie's neck, the other barefooted in the grass. "I need some time." The simple statement hung in the air. David walked toward her, stopping a few feet away. His face showed a complex mixture of emotions: hurt, understanding, and something that might have been relief. "I think," he said carefully, "we both do." The wedding planner stepped forward, phone in hand, ready to manage the logistics of this unexpected development. But before she could speak, Sarah's father stood up. "The reception venue is paid for," he announced, "and the food is ready. I suggest we all go enjoy it. Sometimes a pause is just a pause, not an ending." His practical suggestion broke the tension. Guests began to nod, some even managing small smiles. The catering staff, relieved to have direction, began gathering their things. The wedding planner, adapting quickly, started organizing transportation to the reception venue. "What about Charlie?" someone called out. As if in answer, the stable manager from Sarah's childhood, Mr. Thompson, emerged from the crowd. No one had noticed him arrive, and later, no one could quite remember inviting him. "I'll take him back to the old stable," he said simply. "It's still there, Sarah. Never rented your stall to anyone else." He reached for Charlie's reins, then stopped. "Take all the time you need. Some things are worth waiting for." David touched Sarah's arm gently. "I'm going home," he said softly. "Not to our apartment, to my parents' place. I think I need to remember who I was before us, too." Their eyes met again, and Sarah saw that he understood. This wasn't just about her and Charlie. It was about both of them finding their way back to themselves. Mia took charge of Sarah's belongings while Sarah's mother helped her out of the wedding dress and into a simple sundress that seemed to materialize from nowhere. As the guests departed for the reception, Sarah stood with Charlie one last time. "You found me," she whispered to him. "Now I need to find myself." She kissed his nose, breathed in his familiar scent one more time, and watched as Mr. Thompson led him away, knowing this wasn't goodbye. It was a beginning. Sarah drove her old pickup truck down the familiar dirt road leading to her childhood home. She'd retrieved the truck from her parents' garage, where it had sat unused since her college days. The steering wheel felt right under her hands, the rough country road more welcoming than city pavement. The family farm appeared ahead, unchanged yet somehow smaller than she remembered. The white farmhouse needed a fresh coat of paint, and the fence along the paddock leaned slightly, but the essence of the place remained. Sarah parked in front of the barn, the same spot where she used to dismount from Charlie after their rides. Inside the barn, the smell hit her first: hay, leather, and memories. Her old riding boots still sat on a shelf, covered in dust, but otherwise untouched. Running her fingers along the leather, she found the small scratch from her first jumping competition. She'd been 14, Charlie had been steady beneath her, and together they'd won third place. Sarah climbed up to the hayloft, where she'd spent countless hours reading, dreaming, and writing in her journals. A stack of those journals still sat in a weathered box, protected from the elements by the sturdy roof. She picked up the top one, opening to a random page. "Charlie and I explored the West Meadow today. He knew exactly when I needed to stop and watch the sunset. Sometimes I think he understands me better than anyone. Mom says I need to focus more on school and less on writing, but when I'm with Charlie, everything makes sense." The afternoon light filtered through the barn's wooden slats as Sarah continued reading her teenage thoughts. Page after page revealed the person she'd been: passionate, determined, connected to the land and the animals. When had she started believing that growing up meant leaving all that behind? She found her old competition photos, carefully preserved in plastic sleeves. There she was at 16, seated proudly on Charlie, ribbons pinned to his bridle. Her smile in those photos was radiant, uninhibited, different from the careful smile she'd practiced for her wedding photos. Mr. Thompson stopped by, bringing coffee in a thermos. "Charlie's settling in well," he reported, settling onto a hay bale. "Remembers all his old habits. Horses don't forget, you know. Neither do people, really. They just convince themselves they have to." Sarah shared her coffee with him, listening to stories about the stable's current residents. Mr. Thompson had maintained the place much as it had always been, refusing to modernize despite pressure from developers. Some things are worth preserving, he said simply. Later, Sarah walked the property's boundaries, retracing paths she'd ridden hundreds of times. She found the old oak tree where she'd carved her initials, the creek where Charlie had first learned to cross water, the rolling hill where they'd practiced their gallop. Each spot held a piece of her story, a fragment of her true self. In the fading light, she called David. Their conversation was brief, but honest. He was at his parents' lake house, revisiting his own abandoned passions. Painting, specifically. I found my old easel in the boathouse, he said. Starte da sunset scene. It's terrible, but it feels right. That night, Sarah slept in her childhood bedroom, surrounded by riding trophies and horse posters she'd never taken down. Her dreams were vivid, galloping through open fields, jumping fences that seemed to touch the sky, Charlie moving beneath her like they shared one mind. David stood at the edge of his parents' dock, watching the sun rise over the lake. His easel was set up beside him, a half-finished painting capturing the way morning light played on the water. Paint stained his fingers, a far cry from the manicured hands that had been ready to slip a wedding ring onto Sarah's finger. Inside the lake house, his old art supplies lay scattered across the dining room table. He'd spent the night sorting through them, finding brushes he'd forgotten he owned, tubes of paint still viable after years of storage. Each item sparked memories of the person he'd been before law school, before the corporate job, before the carefully constructed life he'd built. His mother found him there, still painting as the sun climbed higher. She carried 2 cups of coffee and set one beside him without speaking. Patricia had always been the practical one, the voice urging him toward stability and success. Now she studied his painting with new eyes. You know, she said finally, your father and I were wrong. David turned to look at her, surprised by the admission. We told you art wasn't a viable career, that you needed something more substantial. She touched the edge of the canvas gently. We never asked what would make you happy. David added another stroke of orange to the sunrise reflection. I thought I was happy, he said. I had everything planned out. The career, the apartment, the relationship. It all made perfect sense on paper. He rinsed his brush in water that had gone murky with color. But when that horse showed up at the wedding, I saw something in Sarah I'd never seen before. And it made me realize that you've both been playing parts, his mother finished. She pulled out a folder from behind her back. I found these in the attic last night. Inside were David's old sketchbook. Filled with drawings from his college years. Landscapes, portraits, studies of light and shadow. The work was raw but passionate, filled with an energy his current life lacked. His father joined them, looking uncomfortable in the emotional morning air. Son, he began, then stopped. Robert Hamilton had never been good with feelings. I saw your painting from last night, the one at the boathouse. He cleared his throat. It reminded me of why I bought this place. Not for the property value or the status. For moments like this, watching the sun rise, feeling real. David set down his brush. Sarah and I, he said, we try to build a life based on what made sense. But maybe that's not enough. He looked at his painting, imperfect but honest, much like the thoughts he was trying to express. Maybe we both need to figure out who we are when we're not trying to be who everyone expects us to be. His phone buzzed with a text from Jack, his best man. The galleries are interested in your work. From college, it read, never told you, but I showed them your portfolio last year. They've been asking about new pieces. David's hands trembled slightly as he replied. For the first time since the wedding day, he felt something close to excitement. Not the measured satisfaction of winning a case or closing a deal, but the raw thrill of possibility. His mother touched his shoulder. You know, she said, sometimes what looks like an ending is really just life giving you permission to begin again. She paused. Sarah's horse didn't just show up for her that day. Maybe he showed up for both of you. 3 months after the interrupted wedding, Sarah stood in the morning mist at her newly purchased stable. The old Thompson property had come up for sale at exactly the right moment. And with her savings, originally meant for a honeymoon, she'd made the down payment. Charlie grazed peacefully in the paddock alongside 3 rescued horses she'd taken in. The sound of tires on gravel made her turn. David's car pulled up, But it wasn't the sleek city vehicle she remembered. Instead, he drove a practical SUV with paint supplies visible through the windows. He stepped out dressed in jeans and a casual shirt splattered with colors, a far cry from his corporate suits. "You look different," they said simultaneously, then laughed, breaking the initial tension. Sarah's hair was pulled back in a practical braid, her designer clothes replaced with riding gear. David's traditionally clean-shaven face now sported a short beard, and his hands showed traces of various pigments. "I have something to show you," Sarah said, leading him toward the stable's main office. Inside, the walls were covered with large photographs, horses in various states of rehabilitation, their stories written beneath each image. "I'm turning it into a rescue center," she explained, "for horses that need a second chance." David smiled, understanding the metaphor. "I have something to show you too." He pulled out his phone, showing her images of his paintings. They were being featured in a small gallery in the city, landscapes and horses, many inspired by the day Charlie appeared. "They want to do a fundraiser," he said, "for your rescue center." The revelation hung between them, not as a path back to what they were, but as a bridge to who they had become. Sarah led him to the paddock where Charlie stood watching them. The horse approached the fence, greeting them both with equal interest. "You know what's strange?" Sarah said, stroking Charlie's nose. "After all these years, no one ever claimed him. Mr. Thompson checked every registry, every lost horse report. It's like he existed just to show up at that moment, just to remind us that we were living someone else's version of our lives." David finished. He reached out tentatively, and Charlie allowed him to pat his neck. "My mom said something similar, about how sometimes we need permission to begin again." Sarah turned to "O face fully." "I'm not sorry," she said firmly, "about that day, about what happened after." "Neither am I," David replied, surprising them both with his honesty. "Look at us now. You're building something meaningful here. I'm painting again. We're both ourselves," Sarah completed. "For the first time in years, we're really ourselves." Charlie nickered softly, drawing their attention. Sarah explained how she'd discovered his true origin. He'd been born at this very stable 30 years ago, before being sold and eventually finding his way to her childhood home. His return wasn't just a coincidence, it was a completion of a circle. "I have an idea," David said, pulling out his sketchbook. "What if we combine our new paths? My art, your rescue center. We could tell these horses' stories through paintings, raise awareness, create something meaningful together, not as a couple, but as two people who helped each other find their way back to themselves." Sarah looked around at her rescued horses, at Charlie standing watchful in the morning light, at David with his paint-stained hands and honest smile. "You know," she said, "everyone thought Charlie's appearance was about stopping a wedding. But maybe it was about starting something else entirely." They spent the morning planning the fundraiser, sharing stories about their separate journeys of self-discovery. Charlie watched from his paddock, seeming to nod in approval. He had done his job, not just reuniting with Sarah, but helping two people find their authentic paths, even if those paths weren't meant to converge. And so a wedding that never happened led to something more meaningful. 2 lives reimagined, dozens of horses saved, art that spoke to the heart, and a partnership built not on romance, but on the shared understanding that sometimes love means letting go of what you thought you wanted to become who you were always meant to be.